It's July 20, 1969, and a pair of American astronauts are orbiting the moon in the cramped Eagle lunar module. Mission Commander Neil Armstrong and pilot Buzz Aldrin soon detach from the command ship Columbia, where Michael Collins remains. He will circle the orbiter and wait for Eagle to rejoin him. The navigation and separation have already been trained by the U.S. space agency NASA during preparatory flights. But now comes the main thing: the moon landing itself. When reporters later asked the astronauts what they thought the odds were of successfully completing the mission, they agreed it was about 50%. During the wild landing, Armstrong's heart rate soared to 150, and even in the control center on Earth, everyone broke out into a few sweats. The system repeatedly reported the mysterious error 1202. Fuel was running out, and the Eagle missed the designated landing site. Still, at 8:17 p.m. UTC, Armstrong announced to his colleagues on Earth,
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
the dream of visiting the moon has come true. But the Apollo 11 mission was only halfway through. Neil Armstrong was born on August 5, 1930 in Wapakoneta, Ohio. His father worked as an auditor of state institutions. The family moved from place to place, and by Neil's 14th birthday, they had changed 16 different places. His childhood was quite nice. He went to Scouts and dreamed of being a pilot one day. His father took him on a sightseeing flight when he was 6. Neil was so enthralled by the experience that 10 years later he actually passed pilot's tests, even before he got his driving license. At the age of 17, he entered Purdue University in Indiana to study aeronautical engineering. In addition, he got into a Navy program that promised to fund his expensive education. But in the middle of a 4-year bachelor's degree, he had to skip 2 years of training and then serve a year as a Navy pilot. He was called up in January 1949, and 2 years later, he was transferred to combat. He was sent with the aircraft carrier Essex to Korean War. Neil is flying 78 missions in Korea. Even at 21, he's a quality pilot with an analytical approach and the ability to not let anything throw him off. This is confirmed in 1951 when he loses a piece of his wing in a bombing raid on a Korean warehouse near the village of Majeonni and has no choice but to eject. However, he quickly recovers from the accident and flies for several more months. After returning to America, he goes to college, where he rapidly improves his grades in the second half of his studies, and manages to write 2 school musicals too. He also meets Janet Sharon on campus, whom he marries in 1956. Later they give birth to a son, Eric, and a daughter, Karen, which is soon diagnosed with a brain tumor. The young family now lives in the Antelope Valley, just a short drive from Edwards Air Force Base, where Neil was hired as a test pilot. His task is clear: to test various prototypes of new aircraft, point out design flaws, and if possible, land the machine safely again. For Neil, it's a tailor-made job. It's not just about the feel of flying. Test pilots have to understand the machine's design in detail and think like engineers in tense moments. Armstrong has a great handle on all this and is happy at work. Unfortunately, the same is not true of his personal life. He will never fully recover from the death of his 2-year-old daughter, Karen. So when NASA announces accepting civilian astronauts, he decides to sign up for the program. A change of scenery and a move to Houston sounds like a chance for a fresh start. In September 1962, the Armstrongs' phone rings. It's NASA's Director of Flight Operations Deke Slayton calling, saying that if Neil is still interested, they have a place for him in the Gemini program. It was instituted after a speech given by President Kennedy to Congress the year before.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
This was at a time when the so-called space race was going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. By then, the Soviets had a clear advantage, launching the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, into orbit in '57. And then, in April '61, Yuri Gagarin became the first man to fly into space. The Gemini mission was therefore to prepare a flight to the moon that would give the Americans back the upper hand. On March 16, 1966, Neil Armstrong participates in the 75-hour Gemini 8 flight to separate and rejoin the two space modules. This happens without any major problems, but then the whole system starts to rotate uncontrollably. It's a tough time. The control center fears that both pilots will lose consciousness, so they cut off Neil's wife, who is listening to the communication between Houston and the space module. A heartbroken Janet, who is at home with their two sons, the second Mark, was born a year after Karen's death, expects the worst. The failed mission has a happy ending after all. Armstrong gets the rocket under control and returns safely to Earth. The U.S. lunar flight program continues, with the Gemini project being followed by the Apollo program. But it's not off to a happy start. A three-man crew burns to death during a simulation. Moreover, voices are gradually growing that the government should address the problems of ordinary Americans rather than invest billions in an uncertain space adventure. So a nervous NASA leadership launches the crews of Apollo 7, 8, 9, and 10 into space in just 7 months. And since there will be no further accidents, a new decision is made. Apollo 11 will be the groundbreaking mission that will take man to the moon, and 39-year-old Neil Armstrong will be its commander. Although preparations are in full swing, logically no previous mission has tested the landing itself. So NASA engineers will design a special machine for Armstrong that simulates the reduced gravity of the moon. But operating is extremely demanding, and the nervousness in the team is growing day by day. D-Day is finally coming. Armstrong, along with Command Module pilot Michael Collins and Lunar Module pilot Buzz Aldrin, launched from Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, are carried into orbit by a Saturn V rocket, and then continue on their nearly 400,000-kilometer journey. To everyone's great relief, the undocking of the modules is successful, and Armstrong and Aldrin set off in the Eagle for the lunar surface, while Collins, circling the moon, has a clear order. If something goes wrong, he's supposed to return to Earth alone. It sounds harsh, but those are the rules of the game. President Nixon even has a eulogy prepared just in case. Moreover, things really don't look good with the Eagle crew for a while. But error message turns out to be just the result of an onboard computer overload, and despite complications with site selection, Armstrong manages the landing after all. And then, in a live broadcast watched by over 500 million people around the world, he delivers his now legendary line.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin will spend about 2.5 hours on the moon. They'll raise an American flag, collect samples, and try out different ways to navigate the surface. The easiest way to do this is to do some jumping. Then comes the riskiest part of the mission, launching from the moon and rejoining the Columbia. The first problem comes soon. Upon returning to Eagle, Armstrong and Aldrin discover that they have managed to break the engine ignition lever during their ascent in their bulky spacesuits. Aldrin, however, helps himself with a pen, and the lander bounces off the moon's surface, much to their relief. The rendezvous with Collins in orbit is also successful. And on June 24, after 8 days of flight, Columbia and all 3 astronauts will descend safely into the Pacific Ocean.
Apollo, reach the last clear. Our position 1330, 16915. There you are!
After 18 days in quarantine, the trio of astronauts find themselves in a completely unfamiliar world. Literally overnight, they have become global celebrities. Over the course of 6 weeks, they and their wives visit more than 20 countries. And although all 3 are considered heroes, only one of them can be the first man on the moon. But Neil Armstrong, he's not exactly the type who would enjoy mass interest. He quits NASA in 1971, retires, buys a farm in Ohio, and starts teaching at the University of Cincinnati. Later, he also helps investigate the failed Apollo 13 flight and the catastrophic Challenger space shuttle accident. But no matter how much he tries to stay in the background, he will never fully escape his fame and popularity. No wonder, if we still find the Apollo 11 mission challenging today. Back then, in the late 60s, it was something unimaginable. After all, the computers at the crew's disposal were not even up to the level of today's smartphones. And yet the 3 of them did it. And on the windless surface of our nearest celestial counterpart, you can still see the more than half-century-old footprints of Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon.